Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a fascinating journey, really cutting through a stack of source material to explore the intricate evolution of India's foreign policy.
That's right. We're looking at it from the moment of independence right up through the early 2000s.
And our source for this deep dive is some really insightful material excerpts from V.N. Khanna's International Relations 5th edition.
Yeah, it gives a pretty detailed look at how a newly independent India, finding its place in a world dominated by these emerging power blocks and Cold War tensions, basically charted its own course.
On the global stage, yeah.
Hmm.
And our mission for you, the listener, is to cut through all that complexity and really peel out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from these sources.
Mm,
We want you to walk away with a clear understanding of, well, the core principles that guided India, the key relationships that shaped its path.
and those pivotal moments, too.
Exactly, especially the journey to becoming a nuclear power, the things that defined its standing in the world.
Think of it as getting quickly well-informed on a really critical aspect of modern Indian history. We'll throw in some surprising facts, maybe, and just enough context to keep you hooked, help you understand the why behind the policy.
Sounds good. So let's set the stage. India in 1947, a brand new nation, emerging from colonial rule, sort of blinking into the light on a world stage, already grappling with the dawn of the Cold War, these powerful blocs forming.
Yeah, it's a tough starting point.
Right. How did a nation with such huge internal challenges even begin to think about, let alone formulate, a coherent foreign policy?
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundational thinking, it was actually deeply influenced, perhaps surprisingly to some, by figures like Mahatma Gandhi.
Really? Gandhi?
Yeah, I mean, while he wasn't a traditional foreign policy architect in the modern sense, his ideals of peace and nonviolence, they were absolutely central to the initial basis India tried to build its foreign policy upon.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
The moral principles of the independence struggle carrying over into how the new state wanted to act.
Exactly. And then you had Nehru's vision, which seems to have translated these, ideals into more concrete policy goals.
Right, Nehru.
Precisely. The source really highlights Nehru's emphasis on two key concepts: independence of decision-making and self-reliance.
Okay. Independence and self-reliance.
For a nation just gaining its freedom, the idea was clearly not to immediately tie itself to another power's agenda or, become dependent again. It was about maintaining autonomy right from the get-go.
And this pursuit of independent decision-making, especially in a world that was rapidly dividing into opposing camps, that led directly to the concept most associated with India's early foreign policy: non-alignment.
It did, absolutely. And the source is clear that non-alignment wasn't just some abstract term, some fuzzy idea. For India, it meant a very conscious decision to keep away from the major military power blocs emerging at the time.
The U.S. bloc and the Soviet bloc.
Right. The U.S.-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. The goal was to preserve the ability to take independent decisions on international issues based on India's own assessment of the situation and its own interests.
And Nehru saw this non-alignment not just as, say, an ideological choice, but as something really vital for the country itself.
Critically important for India's national interests, that's how the source puts it. It was seen as the most pragmatic path. Pragmatic for preserving India's autonomy, focusing its limited resources on domestic development.
Yeah, nation building.
Exactly. And avoiding being drawn into the conflicts and rivalries of the Cold War powers, which, could easily derail all those nation-building efforts.
And this stance immediately created a really sharp contrast with India's newly formed neighbor, Pakistan.
Oh, absolutely. While India decided to remain non-aligned, Pakistan chose a very different path. They opted to join the U.S.-sponsored military alliances.
Right, SEATO and the Baghdad Pact.
They became members of SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and the Baghdad Pact, which later became CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization.
What did Pakistan get from this alignment, according to the source?
Very significant military assistance from the United States. Massive amounts, actually.
So that immediately set up this dynamic where the two new neighbors, born out of the same independence moment, were on opposing sides, not just globally, but right there in the region.
Absolutely. Different foreign policy foundations right from the start.
So non-alignment was about not joining blocs. But despite that, India wasn't just sitting on the sidelines, was it? It seems India started playing a role internationally quite early on, even sort of asserting itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. The source points out that India started engaging internationally even before achieving full independence. Nehru had already taken the initiative to convene an Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi in early 1947.
Before independence, wow.
Yeah, bringing together leaders to discuss the future of a post-colonial Asia. Then, after independence, India hosted another conference in Delhi in 1949, specifically aimed at helping Indonesia in its struggle against the Dutch.
Trying to stop them reasserting colonial control.
Exactly. So very active early on.
And India took on some pretty significant responsibilities in areas of international conflict or dispute, too, which is quite remarkable for a brand new nation, isn't it?
It really is. The source specifically mentions India's significant role regarding the Korean War in 1953. India was actually chosen by the United Nations to head the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission.
The NNRC.
Right, the NNRC for Korean War prisoners. I mean, think about that. A newly independent nation navigating the early Cold War, being entrusted with such a sensitive neutral role by the UN.
That says something about its early standing.
It really spoke volumes about India's early international standing and the credibility its non-aligned stance initially garnered. And it didn't stop there. India also made a valuable contribution, the source says, to the settlement of the Indo-Chinese problem at the Geneva Conference in 1954.
And later participated in peacekeeping.
Yes, in various UN peacekeeping efforts to places like West Asia, the Congo, Cyprus, so definitely not inactive.
And India even used force, despite that Gandhian influence we talked about, to resolve territorial issues closer to home, like Goa.
That's right. In 1961, India successfully liberated Goa from Portuguese rule using armed force. Now, the source notes that while this was about reclaiming Indian territory, the U.S. was actually quite unhappy about India using force.
Interesting.
Yeah, which again highlights the complexity of trying to adhere to certain principles in a world where the great powers often played by different rules, didn't they?
So right from the beginning, India's foreign policy was this blend. Gandhian ideals of peace, Nehru's pragmatic pursuit of self-reliance and independence through non-alignment, and a willingness to engage actively, even use force when needed for national interest.
A complex mix.
But the source notes that early standing took a hit, a significant hit.
It did. Despite the U.S. and U.K. providing some support to India during the 1962 border conflict with China, the source states quite starkly that the humiliation India suffered at the hands of the Chinese military significantly spoiled India's prestige in world politics.
Spoiled India's prestige. That's strong language.
It was a rude awakening, a real shock regarding the limits of non-alignment when faced with a determined, militarily superior neighbor.
So you see how those initial principles were immediately tested by the messy realities of international politics and regional security? This takes us nicely into how those founding ideas played out in India's most critical and challenging bilateral relationships, often under the shadow of that intense Cold War pressure.
And we have to start with the most enduringly complex one, India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
This relationship, unfortunately, as the source notes, has been adversarial pretty much from the very beginning in 1947. The partition itself created immediate, painful issues, mass movement of refugees, violence.
And disputes over resources.
Yes, early disputes like the sharing of river waters, though the source does note that that particular issue was eventually resolved amicably through the Indus Waters Treaty.
But the really persistent fundamental flashpoint has always been Kashmir.
Absolutely. The source describes Pakistan adopting a permanently hostile attitude on Kashmir right from the outset. It recounts the attack on the state in 1947, orchestrated through tribal irregulars.
After the Maharaja hesitated on accession.
Right. Prompted by Maharaja Hari Singh's initial indecisiveness, India's military intervened only after Kashmir officially acceded to India. That's a crucial point the source makes.
And India took the issue to the brand new United Nations.
Yes, to the UN Security Council. A ceasefire was eventually arranged, a military observer group appointed, and importantly, a provision was made for a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir.
But there were conditions attached.
Crucial conditions. And this is a key detail highlighted in the source. This plebiscite was subject to fulfillment of certain conditions.
Conditions which Pakistan didn't meet.
The source explicitly states that Pakistan did not fulfill the first and most important condition, which was the withdrawal of all its troops from the part of the state it had occupied.
But they still kept raising the plebiscite issue.
Yet, the source notes Pakistan has continued to harp on plebiscite for decades, even after failing to meet the prerequisites set by the UN resolution it accepted. Meanwhile, the source points out that the democratically elected Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir later ratified the state's accession to India.
Which, from India's perspective, fulfilled Nehru's commitment to ascertain the people's wishes.
Exactly, through a representative body.
Beyond Kashmir, Pakistan's foreign policy choices, tying itself to the U.S. bloc, obviously widened the gulf with India.
Yes, Pakistan joining the U.S.-sponsored military alliances, SEATO and CENTO, and receiving massive U.S. military aid, that was one factor. Then later, its growing friendship with China became another major element.
Driven by shared hostility towards India.
The source describes this alignment as driven by a common hostility to India. This dynamic certainly reinforced the adversarial nature of the relationship, making cooperation much harder.
And this alignment had direct and bloody implications for the actual wars fought between the two countries.
It did. The source highlights the 1965 war where India, it says, humbled Pakistan, despite Pakistan openly using advanced U.S. weapons.
Which was against U.S. assurances.
Yeah, contrary to assurances India had received from the U.S. that those weapons wouldn't be used against India. The Tashkent Agreement after that war essentially just restored the previous border status, the status quo ante.
Then came the really decisive war of 1971.
A turning point of immense magnitude. This war, sparked by the crisis in East Pakistan, which led to the creation of Bangladesh, resulted in the unconditional surrender of the Pakistan army to India in East Pakistan and the birth of independent Bangladesh. It was a clear, decisive military victory for India.
After 1971, there seemed to be an attempt, at least on paper, to reset the relationship with the Shimla Conference in 1972.
The Shimla Agreement is significant. The key principle agreed upon there was that all bilateral issues between India and Pakistan, including Kashmir, would henceforth be resolved through direct bilateral negotiations.
Bilaterally, no third parties.
Exactly, without third-party intervention. However, the source states that despite this agreement, no progress was made in regard to Kashmir, and that Pakistan, in fact, continued its efforts to internationalize the issue, which really went against the spirit of Shimla.
And even as the Cold War started to wind down, Pakistan's fundamental stance towards India, according to the source, didn't really seem to change, even though they joined forums like NAM and SARC.
That's precisely what the source suggests. Pakistan joined the Non-Aligned Movement in 1979 and SARC in 1985, formally severing ties with its Western military alliances. But the source states it continued her anti-India tirade and kept on assisting the separatist elements in India.
And playing a role in Afghanistan.
Yes, playing a key role in the anti-Soviet policy on Afghanistan, giving shelter and support to the Mujahideen rebels. The source concludes there was no change in Pakistan's anti-India policy even after the end of Cold War.
Even attempts like the Gujral Doctrine didn't get traction.
Apparently not. Even India's unilateral facilities offered under the Gujral Doctrine in the mid-90s, which was aimed at improving relations with all neighbors through generosity, met with no positive response from Pakistan, according to the source.
And the source points to a specific incident in late 1997 that seemed to confirm this lack of interest in peace from Pakistan's side, almost foreshadowing the Kargil conflict.
Yes, the shelling in the Kargil sector in September 1997 is mentioned. Pakistani troops began heavy shelling on Indian positions, but the source notes the shelling was also targeted at a hospital, a mosque, and a marketplace.
Civilian targets.
Yes, causing casualties and destruction in civilian areas. The source concludes from this that it appeared that the Nawaz Sharif government had no real interest in peace, which unfortunately seemed to foreshadow the more extensive infiltration that led to the Kargil conflict in 1999.
Right. Okay, let's move on to another giant neighbor, China. Relations here started with this sense of almost shared destiny, shared identity, but then took a very dramatic and hostile turn.
They did. Initially, there was a lot of goodwill. India and China shared the experience of being victims of Western imperialism, albeit in different ways, and they had close cultural contacts going back centuries.
And India recognized the PRC very early.
Yes, India was one of the first non-communist countries to recognize the New People's Republic of China in October 1949. And India consistently supported China's claim for representation in the UN, despite the U.S. veto keeping them out for decades. That was a major diplomatic effort by India on China's behalf.
This shared outlook seemed to solidify in the mid-50s with initiatives like Panchsheel, the Five Principles.
Exactly. The trade agreement in April 1954, where the five principles of peaceful coexistence Panchshil were first enunciated by India and China.
Peaceful coexistence, non-interference.
Right, all those principles. And India's recognition of full Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, accepting it as the Tibet region of China in that same agreement. All this pointed towards a potentially strong cooperative relationship based on mutual respect. India really believed in these principles.
But this picture of amity, of Hindi Chini Bye-Bye as it was called, were shattered. First by the Dalai Lama issue, then the 1962 war.
Yeah, the source says China turned hostile after India granted political asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959 following the Tibetan uprising. And then, in a devastating blow to those Panchshil commitments and India's trust, China launched a massive military attack in 1962.
Along the disputed border.
Threatening India's territorial integrity. As the source explicitly states, India was humbled and humiliated. This event just fundamentally changed the dynamics of the relationship for decades.
And this hostility then extended to China's growing relationship with Pakistan.
Yes, the source notes China's support for Pakistan. It appeared to encourage Pakistan's war aim in 1965 to annex Kashmir and provided material support in both the 1965 and 1971 wars against India.
So India faced this sort of pincer movement.
This collaboration between India's two largest neighbors, both hostile towards India at that time, became a persistent major security concern for Indian planners.
And diplomatic relations between India and China were obviously severely impacted for years after '62.
Oh, completely. Ambassador-level relations were suspended. While Indira Gandhi's government took the initiative to normalize relations in 1976 with the exchange of ambassadors, the source notes no progress was made on the core border dispute.
So it was a superficial normalization.
Somewhat. Steps towards broader normalization only truly began later, in the late 1980s, on the suggestion of China's paramount leader Deng Xiaoping. He proposed putting the contentious border issue aside for the time being and developing relations in other areas first.
Shelve the dispute, focus elsewhere.
Basically, yeah. And eventually, a significant agreement was reached in the mid-90s based on this new approach.
The 1996 agreement.
The agreement on confidence-building measures in the military field along the line of actual control, signed in New Delhi in December 1996. This agreement effectively aimed to manage the border dispute, keep tensions low, and put it out of negotiations for the time being.
So they can move forward on other things.
Exactly, allowing both sides to move forward on other fronts like trade and cultural exchange, without letting the border issue constantly derail the entire relationship. A pragmatic step.
Now let's look at the relationship with the United States, the leader of one of those major Cold War blocs India sought to avoid joining. Despite the shared democratic values, it seems it wasn't exactly an easy friendship initially.
No, not at all. The source notes that relations between the world's two largest democracies were actually generally full of tension for a long time, for decades, really.
Why was that?
It stemmed largely from India's policy of non-alignment, obviously, and its opposition to the U.S. policy of building military alliances against communism and supposedly in favor of freedom. India saw these alliances as potentially drawing the world into conflict and undermining the independence of smaller nations.
And America's perceived support for Pakistan was a major irritant for India, wasn't it?
A very significant one. The source states America remained a supporter of Pakistan at the cost of friendship with India. It often adopted an anti-India policy, even voting against India in the UN on issues like Kashmir.
And the arms supplies.
And repeatedly supplying advanced armaments to Pakistan despite India's protests and very real security concerns. This consistent arming of Pakistan, an adversary of India, while the U.S. often lectured India about nonviolence and democracy, was deeply frustrating for Indian policymakers.
So this somewhat adversarial, or at least strained dynamic persisted for a long time.
Nearly 5 decades, according to the source. It wasn't really until 1996-97 that President Clinton started sending out signals of change in U.S. policy.
What kind of signals?
Well, for the first time in 1997, the U.S. forcefully stated that India and Pakistan must resolve all their disputes, including Kashmir, through direct bilateral negotiations. This was a shift away from any hint of mediation or intervention.
Taking a step back.
Yes. Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright made it clear the U.S. wouldn't mediate unless both countries explicitly desired it. And important initiatives for actually improving relations were taken during the Clinton-Goodrell meeting in September 1997. This marked a significant shift in the U.S. approach towards the India-Pakistan dynamic and towards India itself.
Okay, turning to the other superpower, the Soviet Union, or later Russia. This relationship developed quite differently from the U.S. one, didn't it? It evolved into a pretty strong strategic partnership over time.
Yes, quite different. The source highlights the development of strategic relations with the USSR, and this was largely, it says, due to consistent support given to India by the Soviet Union on the question of Kashmir.
The veto power in the UN.
Exactly. That support, particularly at the UN Security Council, where the Soviet veto often countered resolutions unfavorable to India on Kashmir, contrasted sharply with the U.S. stance at the time and became a real cornerstone of the Indo-Soviet relationship.
But this consistent Soviet support sometimes led to accusations, or at least perceptions, of inconsistencies or compromises in India's declared non-alignment policy, didn't it, according to critics?
The source provides examples that illustrate this exact tension. For instance, while India strongly condemned the Anglo-French-Israeli aggression against Egypt over the Suez Canal in 1956.
A clear case of aggression against a fellow non-aligned nation.
Right. But later that same year, India remained virtually silent on the Soviet military intervention in Hungary. It even indirectly supported the Soviet action by voting with them in the UN General Assembly on certain resolutions.
And Czechoslovakia later.
Similarly, the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968 was not condemned by India, and this was even though the USSR had, around that time, decided to supply arms to Pakistan despite Mrs. Gandhi's strong protests.
So critics pointed to this.
Yes. The source notes that critics pointed to these instances as evidence of India bending its non-alignment policy to favor the Soviet Union, its key strategic partner and supporter on Kashmir.
And the strategic relationship culminated in a really significant treaty just before the 1971 war, which proved its value almost immediately.
Absolutely. The Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation with the USSR, signed in August 1971, the source explicitly states this treaty was forced by the context of the time.
What context?
Both China and the United States were openly pledging support to Pakistan on the eve of the Bangladesh War. India perceived this convergence as a significant security threat.
The U.S.-China opening was happening then, too.
Exactly, the Nixon-Kissinger outreach. So crucially, the source notes that this Indo-Soviet treaty proved a deterrent and neither China nor the United States intervened in the war, despite their earlier statements backing Pakistan. It allowed India to prosecute the war successfully without external great power interference.
Later, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s also tested India's stance and the strength of its relationship with the USSR.
It did. The source mentions that the caretaker Prime Minister, Charan Singh, did tell the Soviet ambassador to immediately pull out soon after the intervention began in late 1979.
But then Mrs. Gandhi returned to power.
Yes. When Mrs. Gandhi returned to power in January 1980, she kept silent on the issue, not explicitly condemning the Soviet action or calling for withdrawal publicly.
And critics jumped on this again.
The source notes that critics commented this meant India had compromised with or given up her policy of non-alignment due to its close ties with the USSR. India's argument, however, as presented in the source, was more realpolitik.
What was the argument?
That in view of the then-existing Pak-China-US axis, which was actively supporting the Afghan rebels against the Soviet-backed government, India had to take a pragmatic stand to safeguard its own security interests. These interests were seen as implicitly linked to the Soviet presence countering that axis on its northwestern flank.
So security trumped strict non-alignment.
That seems to be the argument. Mrs. Gandhi did, however, make a point of making an indirect statement against all foreign interventions, without singling out the Soviets, when she presided over the 1983 Non-Aligned Movement Summit in New Delhi. A subtle balancing act.
So what we really see in this whole period is India constantly trying to balance its initial ideals, non-alignment, peaceful coexistence, with the intense pressures and complex relationships of the Cold War.
It's a constant balancing act.
And the source makes it pretty clear that national interest, particularly security concerns regarding Pakistan and China, and the absolute need for support on Kashmir, often dictated a more pragmatic approach, sometimes leading to stances that, well, seemed to bend the strict definition of non-alignment, didn't they?
It wasn't a static policy, was it? It was a high-wire act, constantly adjusting to external realities while trying desperately to safeguard core national interests and maintain strategic autonomy as much as possible in a highly polarized world.
Absolutely. And navigating these global power dynamics wasn't the only challenge, of course. India also had the complex task of building stable, productive relationships with its immediate neighbors, aiming for what the source calls good neighborliness.
Yeah, that was always a stated goal.
Let's look at some of those key bilateral relationships beyond the giants of Pakistan and China. Maybe start with Bangladesh, a nation India played such a major role in creating back in 1971.
Right. And relations were initially very cordial, almost celebratory, as you'd expect, right up until the tragic assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in August 1975. That event introduced political instability and changed the dynamic quite a bit.
And the source notes that Pakistan then tried to, well, exploit the situation in Bangladesh?
Yes, attempting to promote anti-India climate in the name of religion, even in Bangladesh. This religious angle was used to stir up anti-India sentiment in the post-Mujib era.
Beyond politics, there were also ongoing practical issues stemming from the border itself.
Yes, the lack of a clearly demarcated or frankly natural frontier along parts of the border led to significant illegal immigration into India, mostly people looking for employment. The source says this adversely affected India's economy and created social tensions, particularly in the border states.
And specific boundary disputes also persisted for a while.
Yeah, smaller but irritating issues like the Teen-Bega corridor that was a small pocket of Indian territory needed for Bangladesh to access its own enclave inside India, and the dispute over Newmore Island, or South Taupati as Bangladesh called it, which emerged in the Bay of Bengal due to silt deposition. These remained unresolved for some time.
But perhaps the most significant and recurring dispute, according to the source, was over the sharing of Ganga waters.
Yes, from the Farakka barrage, which India built upstream. The basic issue was simple. There just wasn't enough water for both countries during the lean, dry season. This created annual tension and hardship, particularly for Bangladesh downstream.
Were there consistent attempts to resolve this water issue over the years?
Yes, definitely. Agreements were concluded in 1977 and renewed in 1982 for sharing the waters, aiming to meet the needs of both Calcutta Port in India and agriculture in Bangladesh. But these were mostly temporary arrangements.
Until the Gujral Doctrine period.
Finally, under the Gujral Doctrine in 1996, India signed a fresh, comprehensive agreement for 30 years. The source highlights this agreement as providing more water than ever before to Bangladesh and trying to satisfy the minimum needs for both sides. It was explicitly aimed at building relations on a lasting and friendly basis through accommodation and generosity from the upper riparian India.
Okay. Turning north now to Nepal. A neighbor with, ancient ties, deep cultural affinity.
Exactly. The source notes this deep cultural affinity based on shared religion, Hinduism primarily, and cultural practices. But it also points out occasional differences arising from Nepal's attempts to assert its independent identity and foreign policy.
Sometimes seen by India through the lens of China's influence.
Yes, India was often concerned about China's efforts to increase its influence in Nepal, given Nepal's strategic location between the two giants. India, for its part, consistently worked to maintain cordial relations. It provided considerable economic and technical assistance over the years.
Like what kind of assistance?
Constructing roads and airports, cooperating on hydroelectric power generation, harnessing those Himalayan rivers, and offering trade transit facilities through India as Nepal is landlocked.
And the move towards a multi-party democracy in Nepal in the 1990s, that seemed to positively impact relations.
Yes, definitely. With the establishment of multi-party democracy in Nepal in 1990, the source says Indo-Nepalese relations have moved even closer. Both countries are members of SAARC. They share a belief in the principles of non-alignment and peaceful coexistence. So, a generally positive trajectory, despite occasional friction.
Next, let's go south to Sri Lanka. Another neighbor with strong historical and cultural connections, but whose internal challenges became deeply and sometimes painfully entangled with India's foreign policy and even domestic politics.
Indeed. The source describes historically close, intimate relations. It notes the shared history, culture, the fact both are democracies, both were decolonized around the same time, developing nations, non-aligned, founder members of SAARC, lots in common.
But the long-standing Tamil ethnic conflict became a major source of unrest that directly impacted India.
Absolutely. And this conflict had roots, at least partially, in the Tamil population of Indian origin who had settled in Sri Lanka over generations, primarily to work on plantations during the British era.
So the conflict was between the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamils.
Exactly. And many of those Tamils, particularly the Indian Tamils in the Central Highlands, faced issues of statelessness and discrimination. The ethnic conflict between the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamils became increasingly violent in the 1980s. People of Tamil origin, citing discrimination and seeking political rights, began demanding a separate homeland, Elam, in the north and east of Sri Lanka.
Which was unacceptable to the Sinhalese majority.
And the Sri Lankan government, yes.
There were earlier attempts, partially successful ones, to resolve issues concerning the Tamil population of Indian origin, specifically around citizenship.
Yes, the stateless persons issue was addressed through agreements like the Nehru-Catalarala Agreement in 1953, then the Shastri Bandaranaike Agreement in 1964 that settled the fate of about 825,000 stateless persons, figuring out how many would get Indian or Sri Lankan citizenship. And finally, the Gandhi Bandaranaike Agreement in 1974 settled the remaining 150,000.
So the citizenship issue was largely resolved on paper.
Yes, these were important steps, but they didn't really address the underlying ethnic tensions or the growing political demands of the Sri Lankan Tamils, particularly those in the north and east, for autonomy or self-rule.
And the violent conflict in the 80s escalated to a point where India decided to directly intervene militarily.
Yes, that was a hugely significant and ultimately controversial step. The 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, signed between Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and President Jayawardene of Sri Lanka, led to the deployment of an Indian peacekeeping base, the IPKF, in Sri Lanka.
What was the stated aim?
The stated aim was to contain the violence, disarm the various militant groups, including the dominant LTTE, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, and facilitate the implementation of a political solution that would grant some autonomy to the Tamil majority areas within a united Sri Lanka.
But, as the source notes, the IPKF mission didn't succeed and became highly problematic.
Very problematic. The source is clear about the reasons for its failure. Firstly, the presence of Indian troops was increasingly opposed by the Sinhalese majority, who viewed it as an infringement on their sovereignty. They didn't want Indian soldiers on their soil.
And the Tamils.
Secondly, and critically, the Indian troops found themselves having to fight against the very people they were ostensibly there to protect, the Tamil population, specifically the LTTE, after the LTTE reneged on the agreement and refused to fully disarm.
So the IPKF ended up fighting the LTTE.
Exactly. The Indian soldiers suffered heavy casualties in this unexpected and difficult conflict. The force was eventually recalled in 1990 without success, leaving the conflict unresolved and creating significant resentment on both sides in Sri Lanka and back in India.
A difficult legacy. There was also a maritime boundary issue settled during this period, though.
Yes, that was a positive note. The maritime boundary was demarcated in 1974 during that Gandhi Bandaranaike agreement period, and as part of that, India accepted Sri Lankan sovereignty over the disputed Kachativu Island.
A concession by India.
Yes, another instance of India making concessions, hoping to build broader goodwill and settle outstanding issues with a neighbor.
And the source covers the situation later, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the Civil War situation escalated again, creating a fresh dilemma for India.
Yes, by late 1999 and early 2000s, a full-blown civil war-like situation had developed again between the LTTE and government forces. The LTTE gained significant ground militarily, overrunning strategic posts like Elephant Pass in April 2000 and trapping large numbers of Sri Lankan troops in the Jaffna Peninsula.
And the LTTE continued using terrorist tactics.
The source also notes the LTTE's continued use of terrorist acts against Sri Lankan leaders, including suicide attacks that killed a senior minister and severely injured President Chandrika Kumaratunga. It was a very violent period.
This escalating conflict in Sri Lanka, with its strong ethnic connection to Tamil Nadu and India, must have created a very complex dilemma for India's foreign policymakers.
Absolutely, a huge dilemma. The source points out India's natural sympathy for ethnic Tamils, particularly given the large Tamil population in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, with whom Sri Lankan Tamils share strong cultural and familial ties.
So domestic pressure was a factor.
Definitely. While only a small section of people in Tamil Nadu actively supported the idea of a separate Elam state, the political and humanitarian aspects of the conflict were very sensitive domestically in India. However, the source also states very clearly that India could not support secession.
Why not?
For two main reasons. Firstly, it would completely spoil relations with the legitimate government of Sri Lanka, a neighboring sovereign state. Secondly, and perhaps even more crucially for India's own stability, supporting secession abroad could encourage secessionist demands within India itself, particularly in Tamil Nadu.
A dangerous precedent.
A very dangerous precedent. The source quotes the analyst Prem Shankar Ha on the danger of an LTTE victory creating a halo in Tamil Nadu and potentially fueling separatist sentiments there. That was a major concern for Indian policymakers.
So India's policy had to be navigated very, very carefully.
Tread extremely carefully. The source states India respected the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Sri Lanka absolutely. The aim was to do nothing that would either hurt the legitimate interests of the Tamil population or threaten Sri Lanka's integrity as a nation.
So no more military intervention.
Explicitly refused requests for military assistance or troops from the Sri Lankan government in 2000. The lessons of the IPKF had been learned. Instead, India offered humanitarian assistance and consistently stood for a peaceful, negotiated political solution to the conflict. It welcomed Norwegian mediation attempts in 2001-03, hoping they would lead to a lasting settlement.
Balancing competing concerns.
The source includes a quote from Home Minister L.K. Advani expressing concern for the Tamils' well-being while emphasizing the need to ensure peace and justice for them within a united Sri Lanka. That sums up the tightrope walk.
Okay, let's move east now to Myanmar, or Burma as it was often called, a neighbor sharing a significant border, but often less in the spotlight maybe than those to the west.
True. India consistently tried for peaceful, good, neighborly relations with Myanmar. The source notes India's primary concerns regarding Myanmar related to security in its own northeast region.
Insurgency spillover.
Yes, separatist and militant elements from India's northeast often operated from across the porous border and smuggled arms. The source clarifies that the Burmese government wasn't necessarily involved in actively assisting these insurgencies, but noted that the lack of effective state control in some border areas was a problem for India's security.
And India also had to navigate the internal political situation in Myanmar, particularly the military regime and the suppression of democracy.
Yes, the suppression of pro-democracy leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi was definitely a concern for India, given its own democratic values. The source notes her long detention lasted until 2007.
But India didn't actively support the democracy movement.
Despite India's natural sympathy with democratic elements and the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, the source states India adhered to a strict policy of non-interference in Myanmar's internal affairs. And importantly, it did not provide any material assistance to the pro-democracy leadership.
A pragmatic stance, perhaps criticized by some, but the source argues for Myanmar's growing strategic importance for India.
It does. C. Rajamohan is quoted, highlighting Myanmar's critical strategic importance. It's located at the tri-junction of the Indian subcontinent, China, and Southeast Asia, and it's resource-rich.
A bridge to Southeast Asia.
Potentially. Mohan argues that the resource-rich Myanmar will always present itself at the center of any serious Indian policy towards Asia. However, the source points out that historically, Myanmar has not received any serious attention from India's foreign policymakers since perhaps the 1960s, maybe due to the intense focus on Pakistan and China.
So, a need to reprioritize.
Rajamohan argues it's high time India recognized the increasing strategic importance of Burma and elevated it in the country's foreign policy priorities.
And there was a discernible shift in India's approach towards Myanmar in the late 1990s and early 2000s, wasn't there?
Yes, a clear shift. By early 1998, India had noticeably toned down its vocal support for the pro-democracy forces. The source says this pragmatic shift resulted in increased functional cooperation with the military regime then in power.
What did that cooperation look like?
It included reviving economic and commercial links, facilitating low-key political exchanges, and crucially, the government of Myanmar began to fully cooperate with India in curbing insurgency around the border.
So security cooperation was key.
Yes. This cooperation extended to helping curb the flow of illicit arms, checking the narcotics trade, and curbing cross-border insurgencies originating from Myanmar territory that affected India's northeast. Rajamohan is quoted again saying, Indian security officials have been pleased with the results from cooperation with Myanmar. This indicates that security concerns became a major driver of this policy shift towards pragmatic engagement.
So another clear example of India balancing ideals, like democracy promotion, with the hard realities of national interest in this case, border security, and strategic location.
Exactly. It's interesting, despite Prime Minister Gujral suggesting including Myanmar and SAARC back in 1996, the source notes practically no emphasis on Myanmar within the framework of the Gujral Doctrine, which was generally about outreach to neighbors. This again highlights how specific security and strategic needs sometimes overrode broader regional or idealistic approaches.
And the regional context mattered too.
Yes. The source mentions that China, Japan, and the ASEAN countries were already engaging pragmatically with the military regime in Myanmar, focusing on stability and economic development, while Western opposition was often louder, driven more by human rights concerns. ASEAN even granted Myanmar full membership in 1997 despite that Western opposition. India, too, had to decide how to engage with Myanmar in a way that best served its national interest, particularly regarding security in the sensitive Northeast.
What you see across all these relationships with neighbors, really, is the sheer complexity of balancing stated principles, historical ties, domestic political sensitivities, and the hard requirements of national security and economic development. India often had to make pragmatic, sometimes difficult choices.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it? Foreign policy is rarely black and white, especially for a large, diverse country sitting in a complex neighborhood.
Which brings us to a major turning point, one that dramatically altered India's standing on the global stage and fundamentally changed its foreign policy calculus: the decision to become an overt nuclear weapon state in 1998.
This was a monumental decision, no doubt about it. It came 24 years after India's first nuclear test back in 1974.
The Smiling Buddha test.
Right, which India had emphatically described at the time as being for peaceful purposes. But when the Vajpayee government took office in March 1998, it gave the go-ahead to the scientists.
Who were ready.
Who had reportedly been ready and wanting to conduct fresh tests for years, really to validate India's capabilities and properly weaponize them.
What was the primary rationale behind this decision, according to the source material? What was the trigger?
The decision, according to the source, was taken in view of growing security threat from its neighborhood.
Specifically.
This specifically pointed to two neighbors: China, an acknowledged nuclear weapons state with whom India had fought a war and had an unresolved border dispute, and more immediately, Pakistan.
The Pakistan factor.
Yes. The source states, India was convinced by then that Pakistan had secretly developed nuclear bombs with the active assistance of China, a recognized nuclear weapons state. And this combination, a nuclear China and a nuclearizing Pakistan, potentially cooperating, posed a serious and, in the view of the government then, unacceptable threat to India's security.
So it was framed primarily as a response to the perceived nuclear threat from neighbors needing a deterrent. The tests themselves were obviously a significant international event.
Hugely significant. 5 nuclear tests were conducted at Pokhran in Rajasthan in May 1998, quickly dubbed Pokhran II. These tests effectively established India as the world's 6th nuclear weapon state, breaking the existing P5 monopoly.
And India hadn't signed the CTBT.
No. The source notes that India had not signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, which it considered discriminatory because it essentially solidified the nuclear monopoly of the existing powers while preventing others like India from testing and developing their own deterrent. Therefore, India wasn't legally bound by the CTBT not to test.
And after the tests,
India declared that it had collected sufficient data from these 5 tests to maintain a credible nuclear deterrent, and importantly, announced a unilateral moratorium on further testing.
and Pakistan's reaction to India's tests, was it expected?
Pretty much as expected, yes. Pakistan also conducted its own nuclear tests soon after India's, later in May 1998. The source points out that this proved India correct that Pakistan possessed the bomb, which posed a serious threat to India's security.
So it brought the nuclear capabilities out in the open.
Exactly. So while the tests created a new reality for India, they also openly confirmed Pakistan's matching capability, leading to the overt nuclearization of the subcontinent. A new, dangerous chapter.
How did the international community react, particularly the existing nuclear weapon states and other major powers? Was it uniform?
Not uniform, no. There was a very strong negative reaction from most of the existing nuclear weapons states, the P5, but there was one notable exception.
The U.S. reaction.
The U.S. president, under the mandate of American laws designed to punish proliferation, like the Glenn Amendment, immediately imposed wide-ranging economic and military sanctions on India. China and Japan reacted very sharply, expressing anger and concern. Japan's reaction was particularly strong, given its unique historical experience with nuclear weapons.
And the exception you mentioned. Who was that?
France?
France.
Yes, France. The source states France was far more realistic than fellow nuclear powers. Instead of just condemnation and sanctions, France recognized India's sovereign right to conduct the tests as deterrent in the interest of her security. They did not impose sanctions.
And Russia.
Russia also refused a U.S. request to suspend ongoing defense cooperation with India. Britain, while verbally condemning the tests, also did not apply sanctions. So this differentiated response from some key players was actually quite crucial for India in managing the immediate diplomatic fallout.
Following the tests, India moved quickly to articulate its nuclear doctrine, explaining how it intended to manage this new, controversial status.
Yes, Prime Minister Vajpayee and later his officials like the Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh and National Security Advisor Prashesh Mishra expounded on this doctrine. The source breaks it down into key elements. First, India would maintain a minimum but credible nuclear deterrent.
Minimum but credible, what does that mean?
It implies having a sufficient arsenal and delivery capability to retaliate effectively if attacked first, but without aiming for a huge or continuously expanding stockpile like the US or Russia had during the Cold War. The declaration of a unilateral moratorium on testing right after Pokhran II was presented as evidence that India felt it had what it needed for this credible capability.
And the second key principle, the really famous one, no first use.
Absolutely central to the doctrine. India declared a no first use policy, often abbreviated NFU. This meant India pledged it would not be the first to initiate the use of nuclear weapons against any country.
Against anyone.
It further clarified that it would not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states at all. The doctrine explicitly stated that India would use nuclear weapons only by way of defense in retaliation after a nuclear attack was launched against India or its forces anywhere. As Vajpayee stated very clearly, we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons.
A purely retaliatory posture.
Exactly. And the third main part related to international treaties like the CTBT. India reiterated its willingness to move towards de jure formalization of adherence to the CTBT, meaning signing it eventually. And this was a big tack, but it reserved the right to review this decision if, in its judgment, extraordinary events take place that jeopardize India's supreme national interests.
A national security escape clause.
Essentially, yes. And the source notes, somewhat pointedly, that the CTBT itself gives every signatory country the same right to withdraw under such extraordinary circumstances. So India wasn't claiming a unique privilege there.
The source includes commentary from Indian strategic thinkers on this doctrine, highlighting what they saw as its unique aspects compared to others.
Yes. K. Subramaniam, a prominent strategic analyst, is quoted. He emphasized how India's doctrine is different from, and in his view, an improvement over the NATO doctrine of the Cold War era.
How so?
He explains that the NATO doctrine implied the potential use of nuclear weapons even against a large-scale conventional attack if the situation got desperate enough. Flexible response, they called it. India's doctrine, however, does not envisage use of our nuclear weapons in any condition of conventional attack. Its use is strictly restricted to retaliation after India suffers a nuclear attack first.
A higher threshold for use.
Much higher. And C. Raja Mohan also comments on the implications of combining minimum deterrence with no first use. Mohan offers a very clear perspective on the purpose of this approach. He says the only purpose of India's nuclear arsenal is to prevent blackmail from other nuclear powers. By adopting minimum deterrence and no first use, India signals it has, quote, no interest in engaging other states in an arms race, and its arsenal will be kept at the lowest possible level required for credible deterrence.
So possession is the key.
Exactly. The sheer possession of the weapon, he argues, is the sufficient guarantee of India's security. He then uses that potent quote from Henry Kissinger. A loaded gun is more potent than a legal brief. Mohan adds that India now has a loaded gun which she may never use, but its existence provides the security guarantee.
These tests and the subsequent articulation of the doctrine clearly changed how India was perceived globally, didn't they? It shifted the country's image.
Oh, fundamentally.
Yeah.
The source notes that Pokhran II forced other countries to reevaluate their basic assumptions about this country. India's image, often seen internationally as a sort of yogi or a benign democracy, focused more on moral leadership than hard power.
The land of Gandhi.
Right. That transformed into an India that is potentially hawkish in the pursuit of its national interests. Jaswant Singh, who was the external affairs minister then, is quoted describing this transformation as a shift from the moralistic to the realistic.
A move towards realism.
He said, "It is 1/6 of humanity seeking its rightful place under the sun in the calculus of great powers." This signals a much more assertive, self-interested approach to foreign policy emerging.
The source also touches on some initial, maybe clumsy diplomatic missteps in the immediate aftermath of the test.
Yes, it does seem there was an initial period of what the source calls euphoria in India, maybe attempting to sort of muscle into the big boys club straight away, which led to some overenthusiastic errors.
Like naming China.
Yes, the defense minister at the time, George Fernandez, made public comments explicitly identifying China as a potential #1 security threat. This came just after the 1996 confidence building agreement and made the Chinese uneasy and virtually hostile again, according to the source.
And the letter to Clinton.
Similarly, Prime Minister Vajpayee's letter to President Clinton justifying the tests by referencing China's 1962 aggression against India was widely considered a diplomatic gaffe. It really angered Beijing, leading China to describe the tests as an outrageous contempt for international norms.
But India quickly realized the mistake and tried to control the damage from these early errors.
Yes, efforts were definitely made for controlling damage. The Prime Minister's principal secretary, Brajesh Mishra, publicly declared India wanted the best of relations with China, and that dialogue would continue. However, a comment from a Chinese official is noted in the source, reflecting the strained trust at that point. From mutual confidence, we have now moved to mutual apprehension. It clearly took time and effort to rebuild that confidence.
Despite the initial backlash and sanctions from countries like the US and Japan, India wasn't truly isolated for very long, was it? The isolation didn't stick.
No, the source confirms this. The U.S. sanctions, though initially broad, were suspended, at least partially, by October 1998. The source suggests this was partly because they hurt U.S. friend Pakistan more than they harmed India, given Pakistan's weaker economy was more vulnerable.
An unintended consequence for the US.
Perhaps. While the U.S. did try unsuccessfully to get all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, to apply unified sanctions, and President Clinton even asked Russian President Yeltsin to suspend defense cooperation with India, a request Yeltsin flatly refused. The international isolation India initially faced proved short-lived and ultimately ineffective in forcing India to roll back its nuclear program.
And importantly, some major powers actively began engaging with India, seemingly accepting the new reality much faster than others.
Crucially, yes, France really led the way among the P5. During Vajpayee's visit to Paris in September 1998, President Chirac clearly stated he respected India's sovereign right to conduct the tests for its security.
And France wanted closer ties.
Yes, France was keen to increase economic, scientific, and technological ties, explore defense cooperation, including potentially selling sophisticated weapons like Mirage jets, and maybe even nuclear reactors for power generation. The source even mentions the possibility emerging of a broader Indo-French nuclear understanding focused on civilian energy cooperation. France was the only P5 country that didn't condemn India for the tests and quickly initiated a strategic dialogue.
Common ground on a multipolar world, too.
Yes, there was also a noted commonality of views on the emergence of a multipolar world, opposing unipolar dominance, which brought them closer strategically.
Britain also softened its stance after initial criticism, didn't it?
Yes, they criticized the tests verbally but refused to apply sanctions. While relations didn't immediately take off right away, an unexpected step saw the British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook initiating discussions with Jaswant Singh in October 1998. By April 2000, India and Britain launched a roundtable of eminent persons to brainstorm a more multifaceted relationship, building on shared history and common approaches, aiming to enhance trade and commerce.
So, outreach from the UK.
And Jack Straw's appointment as foreign minister in 2001 was seen by the source as further proof of a British desire to strengthen ties with India, moving past the test issue.
Germany, too, initially reacted negatively, but changed its position relatively quickly.
Germany was initially quite angry, yes. They canceled development cooperation talks right after the tests. But by mid-2000, Germany's stand had changed pleasantly, as the source puts it. German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer visited India, building friendly relations.
What was Germany's position by then?
By mid-2000, Germany's position, according to the source, was that India deserved a much better deal in international forums. While they weren't categorical on India's claim for a permanent UNSC seat, Germany was also a candidate. After all, they acknowledged India's importance as one of the biggest and most important powers. And critically, the world, including Germany, had come round to realize the reality of India's nuclear weapons. They were no longer asking India to destroy them.
Strength begets strength.
J.N. Dixit is quoted saying exactly that. Strength begets strength. suggesting India's demonstrated nuclear capability actually earned it more respect and attention from powers like Germany. Germany also became supportive of India's position on combating cross-border terrorism emanating from Pakistan.
And Russia remained a steadfast and, well, unique friend throughout this whole period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Russia is described in the source as one of India's all-season friends, consistently determined to consolidate the friendship, nuclear tests or not. Russia openly supported India's claim for a permanent seat in the UNSC.
High-level visits continued.
Frequently. President Putin is quoted telling India's defense minister George Fernandez that Russia was interested in India being a strong and defense-capable nation. For this corresponds to Russia's strategic and national interests. He even called himself the closest, dearest, and best friend of India.
Strong words.
Very strong. They reiterated their joint resolve to combat international terrorism and religious extremism, upgraded their joint working group on defense cooperation to a ministerial level. A pact on nuclear cooperation for power generation was signed in July 2000. Russian officials stated their relations with India had self-sufficient intransient value, meaning they weren't dependent on Moscow's relations with other countries like the US or China.
And India reciprocated this.
India, too, maintained its belief that its relations with one major power wouldn't be at the cost of others. India even assured Moscow that its support for the controversial U.S. National Missile Defense (NMD) proposal wouldn't affect their ties, remaining sensitive to Russia's security concerns on that front. Annual meetings between the foreign ministers became a regular feature, cementing the strategic partnership.
So this period clearly marked the end of India's brief post-Pokhran international discomfort, or isolation as some called it.
The source confirms this quite clearly. By the end of the 20th century, Pakistan was ironically back under military rule under General Musharraf after a coup. India's so-called isolation after the tests had decisively ended.
Why does the isolation fail?
Countries that had condemned and sanctioned India realized it was a determined nation that could not be humbled or humiliated by such measures. The sanctions failed, partly due to India's vibrant economy, which provided resilience and was becoming too important to ignore. The nuclear India was increasingly being befriended and sought by almost all the major powers.
A shift in global dynamics.
By the early 21st century, foreign policy was moving fast, and many countries were willing to accept India's friendship, its nuclear status, and develop strategic relations with democratic India. The pariah status, if it ever truly existed, was very short-lived.
The source includes some really powerful quotes reflecting this shift in perception both internationally and within India itself about its new status.
It does. Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, who was deeply involved with the nuclear program and later became president, is quoted reflecting on the May 1998 tests. "I rejoiced when we shook the earth. I also felt that we had broken the nuclear power domination. Now nobody could tell our nation of 1 billion people what to do. It is for us to decide." A real sense of empowerment there.
And the change in the U.S. perspective is highlighted by that anecdote involving Strobe Talbott.
Yes, the Deputy Secretary of State. Initially expressing sadness and dismay at the tests, he was later tasked by President Clinton to negotiate directly with Jaswant Singh on the nuclear issue. The source notes the irony that Talbott, who had apparently come to India back in 1994 to ask India to cut, roll back, and eliminate its nuclear program,
The old U.S. non-proliferation line.
right, was now engaged in 10 rounds of talks by early 2000 with the representative of a nuclear India. This negotiation itself, regardless of the outcome, was a tacit acknowledgement of India's new status. You negotiate with nuclear powers. You don't just dictate to them.
So you really see how a high-stakes decision on national security becoming a nuclear power had these complex global ripple effects. India navigated the international backlash not by apologizing or rolling back, but by asserting its new reality and engaging major powers, often from a position of newfound, albeit controversial, strength. This process fundamentally redefined its global standing, shifting that image from moralistic idealism towards a more realistic pursuit of national interests in a much more assertive manner.
It was a significant transformation, absolutely, a kind of coming-of-age moment, perhaps, in its foreign policy posture.
And this more assertive, pragmatic approach wasn't just confined to relations with the major powers. It extended to broadening India's engagement across the globe in the early 2000s, actively seeking opportunities beyond the traditional Cold War alignments and the often difficult neighborly complexities we discussed earlier.
Absolutely. Let's look at some of these expanded horizons from that period. Within the immediate neighborhood, SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, continued to be a focus, at least officially.
Despite the difficulties.
Yes. India worked for its success despite Pakistan's tendency, the source notes, to raise the contentious issue of Kashmir within the forum, which actually went against the SARC Charter's focus on economic and social cooperation, not bilateral political disputes.
Were there any achievements in SARC then?
Well, significant steps like the planning for SAFTA, the South Asian Free Trade Area, began around 2001, though actual implementation took longer. And the admission of Afghanistan as a new member in 2006 are mentioned in the source as developments within SARC during this period, broadening its scope.
There was also a specific initiative related to the wider Indian Ocean region.
Yes, the Indian Ocean Rim Initiative, or IORXE as it was called. India actively pursued this, particularly collaborating with South Africa. The source notes the huge potential for regional cooperation and trade in this vast region, home to about 2 billion people.
But there were challenges.
Yes, it also points out that at the time, there was an unfavorable balance of trade for India in this region, meaning India imported more than it exported to these countries. So economic potential, but also work to be done.
Now, a major new foreign policy thrust during this period, and one that continues to be incredibly relevant today, was the Look East policy.
Ah, yes, look east. This policy was actually first initiated, somewhat tentatively, by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao back around 1993. The primary aim, then, was really to reconnect economically with the dynamic, fast-growing economies of Southeast Asia after the Cold War ended and India itself was liberalizing its economy.
And Vajpayee gave it a new push.
It gained significant new thrust under Prime Minister Vajpayee from 2001 onwards, and importantly, the source emphasizes this policy had national consensus behind it. It was supported by all governments since Rao, seen as a necessary strategic shift beyond just South Asia.
And this engagement with Southeast Asia expanded rapidly, even despite the challenges India faced elsewhere, like the post-Pokhran sanctions.
Yes, remarkably so. Despite hurdles like the international reaction to India's nuclear tests and the Asian economic crisis of the late 90s, which hit Southeast Asia hard, India's relations with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, expanded quickly.
Vajpayee personally invested in it?
Yes, he personally invested a lot of diplomatic capital in it, visiting 7 ASEAN countries in just 3 years. He signed numerous bilateral agreements, culminating in the landmark India-ASEAN Framework Agreement on Comprehensive Economic Cooperation in 2003. This laid the groundwork for a full free trade agreement later on.
The source connects this policy back to an earlier, perhaps unrealized, vision of India's first Prime Minister, Nehru.
It does. Raja Mokhan is quoted again, suggesting that Nehru's initial vision of broader Asian solidarity, which hadn't been fully realized perhaps due to the complexities of the Cold War, and Nehru's focus on global non-alignment rather than regional blocs, was now being realized in an unexpected way through increased economic cooperation.
A shift from idealism to economics.
Yes, Yashwant Sinha, who was the External Affairs Minister in 2003, is also quoted noting the shift in approach. He said it moved from an idealistic cooperation based purely on, say, shared colonial experience and cultural ties, to a rhythm determined increasingly by trade, investment, and production. It was about building concrete economic linkages for mutual benefit.
And this policy continued and deepened under the next Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh.
Yes, absolutely. It became a cornerstone of his foreign policy as well. There were continued high-level exchange visits, regular India-ASEAN summits became a standard feature, trade and investment grew rapidly, and strategic cooperation started developing through platforms like the Asian Regional Forum, the ARF.
The trade numbers showed this growth.
Definitely. The source notes that trade between India and ASEAN multiplied fourfold just between 1991 and 2002, from about $3.4 billion to around $12 billion. Vajpayee even set an ambitious target of hitting $30 billion by 2007. India also signed separate bilateral FTAs with key ASEAN members like Thailand and Singapore to accelerate things further.
Specific visits during this period highlighted the depth and variety of potential cooperation within this Look East policy framework.
Yes, for instance, during Vajpayee's visit to Thailand in October 2003, he articulated a concept he called Panch Ratna, or 5 jewels, for cooperation.
What were they?
Using Thailand as a commercial bridge for India into Southeast Asia, while India provides a huge market and manufacturing base for Thailand. Leveraging India's biotech skills with Thailand's rich biodiversity. Utilizing India's satellite capability for applications like remote sensing in the region. Developing cultural and pilgrimage centers in India using Thai expertise in hospitality and tourism. He even acknowledged the quiet support of Thai people for India's freedom struggle historically, mentioning Subhash Chandra Bose and the Ghadar Party finding support in Bangkok.
Interesting historical connection. And a land bridge idea.
Yes, the Thai Prime Minister at the time, Thaksin Shinawatra, also proposed a land bridge, linking the Andaman Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. This could potentially help India develop oil and gas exploration in the Andaman Sea region by providing a faster transit route for resources.
And visits to countries like Vietnam and Indonesia were also significant examples of this renewed Eastern focus.
Very much so. Vajpayee described his Vietnam visit as not just look east, but perhaps a relook east, emphasizing the historical depth of ties going back to leaders like Nehru and Ho Chi Minh. He noted the visible warmth, Vietnam's successful shift from a centrally planned to a market economy.
And Vietnam supported India on key issues.
Yes, significantly, Vietnam gave full backing to India's stand on Kashmir and its claim for a permanent UNSC seat. India, in turn, supported Vietnam's bid to join the WTO. So a strong foundation of friendship being built upon.
And Indonesia.
The Indonesia visit was also highlighted as highly significant, given Indonesia's status as the world's largest Muslim-majority country and its growing economic importance. A highlight was the signing of an agreement on defense cooperation and a decision to boost bilateral trade via a joint commission. The source notes Indonesia was limping back to democracy after decades of autocratic rule under Suharto, and India's engagement during this transition was seen positively.
Okay, shifting regions again. India also worked on consolidating ties in the strategically vital region of West Asia during this time.
Yes, maintaining traditional friendships there, but also finding new friends or deepening existing ties. India had long-standing historical connections with most West Asian countries, rooted in trade, obviously huge energy needs, and a large Indian diaspora working in the region.
How are relations generally?
The source notes traditional ties remain strong, with few major differences overall. Although some members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, would occasionally raise concerns about Kashmir, often influenced by Pakistan's lobbying efforts within that group.
India's nuanced stance on conflicts within the West Asian region itself is also highlighted in the source.
Yes, it shows India trying to maintain balance. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, India was very concerned, as both were fellow non-aligned movement members. India encouraged peace and played a mediatory role behind the scenes.
And the first Gulf War, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, India, despite having a large diaspora in Kuwait who suffered terribly during the invasion and occupation, fully supported UN efforts to vacate the aggression and restore Kuwait's sovereignty. India even supported the UN-mandated use of force to achieve this liberation, although it did not join the US-led coalition force itself. India welcomed Kuwait's liberation afterwards.
However, India's position differed significantly regarding the second major conflict involving Iraq, the US-led invasion in 2003, which was undertaken without a clear UN mandate.
Yes, a very different stance there. The source notes the U.S.-led coalition's action ignored the UN Security Council and was based on controversial grounds like seeking regime change and alleged weapons of mass destruction that were never found.
And India's reaction.
India not only opposed this unilateral action, but the Indian parliament unanimously deplored it, reflecting very strong national sentiment against military intervention without international legitimacy. India's belief, as stated clearly in the source, was that regime change is fundamentally a matter for the country's own people, not for external powers to impose.
So no Indian troops for reconstruction.
Consequently, India refused requests to send troops for reconstruction or peacekeeping efforts in post-invasion Iraq, explicitly stating this was because the request came from the U.S. Occupation Authority without any United Nations mandate. This position was similar to that taken by countries like Russia and France.
Renewed high-level contacts with Iran are also mentioned as part of this broader West Asia focus in the early 2000s.
Yes, Prime Minister Vajpayee visited Iran in 2001. Both sides pledged support to liquidate terrorism, a shared concern, and agreed to enlarge bilateral cooperation and increase trade significantly.
And energy diplomacy became a really significant factor driving engagement with Iran, didn't it?
Hugely important. The Indo-Iranian Joint Working Group was set up, co-chaired by the foreign ministers Jaswant Singh and Kamal Karazi. The explicit aim was to establish a long-term energy partnership and identify practical means to transport Persian Gulf and potentially Central Asian natural gas to the energy-hungry Indian subcontinent.
Pipelines.
That was the big idea. India, described as hungry for this source of energy, eyed Iran's huge natural gas reserves. The source notes the Pakistan factor remained a major challenge for an overland pipeline transiting through Pakistan, especially given the tense relations. But it still called Indo-Iranian energy cooperation a welcome development, with significant long-term potential, maybe hinting at other options like subsea pipelines or LNG.
Turning north again to Afghanistan. After the fall of the Taliban regime following 9/11, India stepped up its support for the new government there.
Yes, India fully supported the Hamid Karzai government that was set up after the Bonn Agreement. The source says Rome Accord 2002, likely referring to follow-up meetings or Bonn process broadly, which aimed at restoring normalcy and rebuilding the country after decades of war.
What kind of support did India provide?
India provided substantial assistance, focusing on areas like health services, helping revive the education system, especially for women and girls who had been banned from schooling under the Taliban, providing infrastructure like buses for public transport, and assisting with aviation services, including starting a direct Delhi-Kabul flight.
Was this appreciated?
The Karzai administration publicly expressed gratitude for India's timely and significant help. Afghanistan, later joining SAARC in 2006, was seen as another positive step that could further strengthen regional cooperation and understanding.
India also reached out westward during this time to Turkey, a country with historical connections but perhaps some Cold War distance.
Right. Turkey, a secular nation with a Muslim-majority population and a historical friend of India since the time of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and the Khilafat movement support.
But Turkey was in NATO.
Exactly. It had maintained a certain distance during the Cold War, primarily due to its membership in NATO, placing it firmly in the Western camp. However, in the emerging multipolar world of the early 2000s, both countries saw value in seeking closer ties.
Vajpayee visited Turkey.
Yes. Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit in September 2003 was described in the source as highly rewarding. A key outcome was the expression of total identity of views on the need to combat international terrorism. They signed an agreement to set up a joint working group specifically on combating terrorism, which the Turkish PM at the time, Erdogan, described as an example of new approach.
Other agreements, too.
Yes, agreements on science and technology cooperation and information technology were also signed, laying the groundwork for broader economic and strategic ties between these two large, strategically located countries.
Now, a previously very complex relationship that saw normalization finally happen in the 90s and then deepened significantly in the early 2000s was the one with Israel.
Yes, this was a major shift. India granted diplomatic recognition to Israel way back in 1948, very early on, but perhaps influenced by its close ties with Arab nations, its large Muslim population, and Cold War dynamics, it only established full diplomatic relations in 1992 under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao.
A controversial decision, then.
A decision the source says involved overcoming fear of reaction from certain domestic and international quarters. Interestingly, the source notes, somewhat ironically given the long delay in formal ties, that Israel had apparently been a consistent supporter of India's position on Kashmir at international forums even before full diplomatic ties were established in 92.
And relations grew notably closer in the early 2000s.
Very much so. High-level visits by senior Indian ministers like Home Minister L.K. Advani and External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh really solidified the ties. India made a conscious effort to maintain its traditional friendship with the Palestinians, renewing contacts with Yasser Arafat to kind of balance its approach. But India made a clear decision to also significantly enhance friendship and cooperation with Israel across various fields.
Counterterrorism was a key area.
Yes, both countries saw themselves as victims of terrorism, although the source takes care to note the nature of the terrorism faced by each differed significantly. They agreed to work together on this issue, with Jaswant Singh calling terrorism a global challenge, requiring a global mechanism, and specifically requesting intelligence cooperation from Israel during his visit.
Specific areas of cooperation began to emerge rapidly beyond just security.
Yes. Jaswant Singh's visit was seen as introducing India to the loop of consultations on the West Asia peace process. The Israeli PM at the time, Ehud Barak, was reportedly keen on India's involvement, perhaps seeing India's positive political equations with the Palestinians as potentially helpful. So, political engagement was emphasized.
And economic ties.
They also agreed to expand the institutional base for cooperation, particularly in areas like computer software where India had strengths. A joint commission covering trade, energy, service, and technology was agreed upon in principle to structure future cooperation.
And then a truly landmark visit took place in 2003.
Yes, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's visit in September 2003. This is the first ever visit by an Israeli Prime Minister to India and was widely described as a landmark. Sharon called India one of the most important countries in the world, reflecting the growing Israeli recognition of India's global significance.
Terrorism again a focus.
Yes, both leaders decided to cooperate closely to fight terrorism, which they said caused misery to both peoples, and issued joint calls for a just and durable peace in West Asia and decisive global action against terrorism.
And defense cooperation became a very significant pillar.
Hugely significant. This included Israel agreeing to sell sophisticated Falcon airborne early warning radar systems, AYCS, to India after overcoming some external obstacles, presumably related to U.S. sensitivities initially. There was talk of integrating these onto Russian transport aircraft for the Indian Air Force. Potential co-production of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and installation of advanced electronic warfare systems were also discussed. This marked the beginning of really substantial multidimensional cooperation.
How did the U.S. react to this growing India-Israel friendship?
The U.S. welcomed it. The source says the U.S. expressed willingness to work constructively with both countries, noting the potential for even a trilateral U.S.-India-Israel dialogue or cooperation, perhaps similar to the Russia-China-India trilateral discussions that were also starting around that time.
Okay, let's look briefly at Japan again. We mentioned their hostile reaction to Pokhran II, given their unique history. How did that evolve?
Yes, as the only country to experience atomic bombs, Japan's anger against nuclear weapons and proliferation was understandably very deep and strongly felt. Despite being friendly with other existing nuclear weapon states, Japan became one of the most hostile countries towards India after Pokhran II, imposing sanctions and cutting off significant amounts of aid.
But that changed.
Yes, the source notes a significant improvement by 2000. While Japan remained formally critical of India's nuclear status on principle, it pragmatically began improving trade ties. Visits by former Japanese PM Hashimoto and Indian ministers like Defense Minister Fernandez and Commerce Minister Moran initiated steps for increased trade and gradually improved political and strategic relations. The source even mentions the possibility of joint military exercises being discussed down the line. By 2003, relations were described as becoming notably more cordial again, demonstrating that even strong initial reactions could be overcome through sustained diplomatic and economic engagement.
India also significantly deepened its ties with the European Union as a bloc during this period, beyond just individual members like France, UK, Germany.
Yes, India was very keen to further improve its ties with the EU, seeing it as a major economic and political partner. The first ever India-EU summit was held in Lisbon in June 2000, signaling a new, higher level of institutionalized engagement.
What was the main focus?
The focus was significantly economic. Prime Minister Vajpayee initiated a process specifically aimed at attracting faster foreign direct investment (FDI) inflow from the EU. They established a joint government industry group tasked with resolving project difficulties and speeding up approvals in key areas like highway development, power, and general infrastructure, all critical for India's domestic development agenda.
India also used this forum to explain its nuclear capability in a broader strategic context.
Yes, Vajpayee apparently told EU leaders that the development of India's nuclear capability should be seen in the context of the need for a plural security order for an interdependent world facing complex new challenges. He also reiterated India's commitment to sign the CTBT after a national consensus was reached domestically,
Finding common ground on global order.
India also found common ground with key EU members, particularly France, in supporting the concept of a multipolar world. India envisioned this providing it with more strategic space and autonomy to pursue its interests, rather than a world dominated by a single superpower.
The EU also showed support for India on key security concerns, particularly regarding terrorism.
Yes, this was important. The EU endorsed India's concern on terrorism, stating in joint statements that it remained a major threat and agreeing to bolster joint efforts. Crucially, the EU fully supported India's long-standing stand that dialogue with Pakistan could only resume after the cessation of cross-border terrorism originating from Pakistan.
A diplomatic win for India.
The source notes this as a success for India's diplomacy, securing EU support not only for its economic development agenda, but also for its core policy towards Pakistan, which India saw as openly supporting jihad against it at the time. Annual summits became a feature, with trade and cooperation expanding rapidly, building on the strong bilateral ties with key members like France and Germany we noted earlier.
Australia, another significant country in the Indo-Pacific region, also saw closer ties during this period.
Yes, Australia, which had also reacted negatively to India's 1998 tests and imposed sanctions, underwent a similar change in stance to others. By the early 2000s, it welcomed dialogue on strategic issues and publicly acknowledged India's commitment to economic reforms and liberalization.
Howard's visit.
Australian Prime Minister John Howard's visit in July 2000 indicated that Australia was actively seeking India, as the source puts it. He stated quite clearly that he wouldn't let lingering differences over the 1998 tests contaminate a new dialogue. This reflected a broader recognition in Canberra of India's growing economic and strategic importance in the region.
There was also a specific initiative mentioned, focused on engaging more deeply with the Islamic world more broadly, beyond just West Asia.
Yes, the source highlights a new initiative towards the Islamic world, which was described as being widely welcomed. Jaswant Singh's visit to Iran, mentioned earlier in the West Asia section, is presented as an example of this broader thrust. The idea was based on the belief that there was enormous scope for pragmatic and profitable engagement with key Islamic nations across various regions, going beyond just historical ties or purely diaspora-related concerns.
Okay, let's revisit the relationship of the United States one last time, especially looking at the period after President Clinton's landmark visit in 2000, which seemed to mark a real turning point.
Yes, that visit was seen as very significant. Jan Dixit, the former foreign secretary and strategic thinker, is quoted saying Clinton's visit was a culmination of months of effort that opened lines of communication with everybody, maybe even contributing to improved ties with countries like Japan, who saw the U.S. engaging India seriously.
But some caution, too.
Yes, Machkud Dubey, another former diplomat, while giving Clinton credit, cautioned against going overboard with enthusiasm. He called it a sobering change and emphasized that the onus was now really on India to maintain the dynamism in the relationship, to build on that opening.
And Raja Mohan had a memorable take on it.
He did. C. Raja Mohan captured the shift in dynamic quite well, saying India was so used to having arguments and fights with everybody, it almost couldn't get used to being agreed with. He emphasized the need for India to realize the world now needs India, just as India needs the world, a psychological shift from being a supplicant to becoming a potential major partner.
The election of President George W. Bush in 2001 saw further positive developments and even areas of surprising common ground, didn't it?
Yes, surprisingly so in some areas. President Bush's decision early on to unilaterally reduce U.S. nuclear forces was welcomed by India in May 2001, as it seemed to align with India's long-standing call for global nuclear disarmament by the major powers.
And the NMD proposal.
Even more surprisingly, India notably hailed Bush's controversial proposal to build a national missile defense (NMD) system. Raja Mohan called this support probably the first time in decades that India has extended such support to the U.S. on any global nuclear issue.
Why did India support NMD?
The source suggests India's positive response was guided by the expectation of potential future international cooperation in developing defensive technologies from which India might benefit, and perhaps also seeing it as a move away from purely offensive nuclear doctrines based on mutually assured destruction. India was also apparently pleased that Russia and America might move towards dialogue on missile defense rather than confrontation, even though Russia and China themselves were very skeptical of the U.S. NMD proposal at the time.
And the early 2000s, under Bush and Vajpayee Manmohan Singh, laid the groundwork for perhaps the most significant agreement between India and the U.S. in decades, the civil nuclear deal.
Absolutely. The framework for this landmark deal was concluded by President Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in July 2005, although the actual complex negotiations and legislative approvals took longer.
What was the essence of the deal?
Under this agreement, India agreed to take the unprecedented step of separating its civil and military nuclear facilities and placing 14 of its designated civilian nuclear reactors under permanent International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, supervision and safeguards. In return, the U.S. agreed to resume full civil nuclear cooperation with India, effectively overturning decades of technology denial and sanctions targeting India's nuclear program since the 1974 test.
The huge shift in U.S. policy.
A massive shift. The formal 123 agreement, detailing the precise terms, was still being negotiated in mid-2007 when the source material likely ends. The main obstacle mentioned in the source during these negotiations was the U.S. insistence that all cooperation would automatically end if India conducted another nuclear test in the future.
India couldn't accept that.
India found this restriction difficult to accept, as it felt it impinged upon its sovereign right to test if its supreme national interests were ever jeopardized in the future, a right it had explicitly reserved in its nuclear doctrine back in 1998. So that was a key sticking point being hammered out.
Finally, the source touches on the emergence of potential trilateral and multilateral cooperation forums during this period, reflecting India's engagement in a more complex global governance landscape beyond just bilateral ties.
Yes, India, committed to the idea of a multilateral, multipolar world order where power is dispersed rather than concentrated in one or two poles, was involved in discussions about potential trilateral cooperation involving Russia, China, and India. This often got referred to as RIC.
Whose idea was this?
It was initially suggested by Russia, particularly by figures like Yevgeny Primakov earlier on. It was framed not as a new power bloc aimed against anyone, like the U.S., but rather focusing on areas of potential common interest, like economic cooperation, promoting strategic stability, and jointly fighting threats like international terrorism and religious extremism.
How did that potential RIC trilateral develop in the early 2000s? Was there immediate enthusiasm?
Initially, there was some reluctance, perhaps skepticism from China, and a somewhat lukewarm response from India as well. However, from 2001 onwards, progress was made primarily through meetings between the foreign ministers of the three countries on the sidelines of the annual UN General Assembly sessions in New York.
Did the atmosphere change?
Yes. While the Chinese foreign minister reportedly raised the sensitive issue of South Asia being a nuclear flashpoint in the 2002 meeting, by the 2003 meeting, the source says the atmosphere had totally changed, becoming very cordial. The three foreign ministers apparently interacted as partners of building a new world order.
India's foreign minister commented on this shift.
Yes, Yashwant Sinha stated after the 2003 meeting that they had set the stage for greater understanding and cooperation. They agreed on cooperation on issues like the situation in Iraq and the need for UN reform. He noted significantly that no contentious bilateral issues were raised in that 2003 meeting, indicating a maturation and compartmentalization in the relationship.
Was a summit planned?
While a full RIC summit meeting was not considered imminent as of 2003, the concept of triangular cooperation, not aimed against anyone, was seen as definitely on the cards. Sinha advised moving with caution, patience, and deliberation towards it. Prime Minister Vajpayee's positive interactions with the new Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao at an ASEAN summit around that time also fed into this gradually improving strategic dialogue.
So this period, therefore, clearly shows India's diplomacy moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, engaging a wide variety of partners across the globe.
Yes, the source concludes that Indian diplomacy during this time was certainly moving towards a great power status. Relations with Japan, for instance, were seen as poised for a big leap forward. And India was also increasingly being invited to interact with the G8 group of highly industrialized countries.
The G8 outreach.
Exactly. Attending summits along with other fast-developing economies like China, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico from the early 21st century onwards. This group of invitees informally became known as the G5, and their interaction with the G8 became a regular feature by 2007, reflecting India's growing economic and political weight on the world stage.
So you really see how India broadened its engagement dramatically after the end of the Cold War, and especially after the nuclear tests. It actively pursued economic and strategic ties across Asia, West Asia, Europe, and with major global players like the U.S. and Russia simultaneously, often balancing competing relationships very carefully. The engagement in these new trilateral and multilateral forums reflected a more complex, more assertive India navigating an emerging multipolar world, leveraging its growing capabilities and strategic location.
It was definitely a period of significant transformation, a shift from primarily reacting to global blocs and regional threats to actively shaping its position and pursuing its interests on a much wider, more global canvas.
Bringing it all together then, this deep dive really reveals that India's foreign policy, all the way from the initial idealism of non-alignment and peace, through the pragmatism required to navigate those tough Cold War rivalries, the assertiveness displayed in becoming a nuclear power, and then the expansive global engagement of the early 21st century. It has consistently been rooted in the pursuit of its national interest.
That's the bottom line, isn't it? As Eric Gonsalves, a former Indian diplomat, is quoted in the source, foreign policy formulation is ultimately done according to the country's national interest. The main objective is always to create and maintain an international environment that suits these national interests. And India's policymakers across different governments and eras have consistently tried to achieve this objective, using different tools at different times.
And the source argues there's a certain underlying maturity and continuity to India's foreign policy trajectory, despite all the shifts and turns we've discussed.
Yes, it highlights that the policy hasn't been radically altered with every single change of government. Nehru's foundational policy principles, non-alignment, even if adapted, peaceful coexistence, pacific settlement of international disputes remained a kind of cornerstone even 60 years later, although obviously adapted to vastly different global realities.
And a focus on the region.
There's also a noted concentration on regional problems, particularly security challenges since the 1960s, reflecting the enduring importance of the immediate geopolitical environment. The major decisions and actions over those 6 decades, as laid out in the source, reflect this continuous effort to balance various factors: its historical legacy, geographical imperatives, domestic needs and compulsions, and the constantly evolving international system.
So this deep dive really shows India's foreign policy as a dynamic response, doesn't it? Shaped by its geography, its history, its culture, its domestic priorities, and that ever-changing international environment, but always anchored, ultimately, in the pursuit of its national interest, sometimes leading to stances that might appear contradictory unless you view them through that pragmatic lens.
It's definitely a policy that adapted significantly over time, reflecting India's own journey from a newly independent, developing nation finding its feet on the world stage to an aspiring major global player by the early 21st century, complete with nuclear weapons and a rapidly growing economy.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. From those initial principles of peace and non-alignment, through the intense pressures of the Cold War and navigating those complex, often fraught neighborly relations, the pivotal, game-changing decision to become a nuclear power and its complex global aftermath, right up to India's expanding regional and global engagement in the early 2000s.
It's a really fascinating story, isn't it? A story of a nation finding its voice, asserting its place in a constantly changing world, trying to balance its ideals with pragmatic realities, always with that calculation of national interest as the guiding compass, even if the definition of that interest evolved over time.
Absolutely. And as you, the listener, reflect on this journey we've traced, here's a final thought to leave you with, one drawn directly from the source material we've explored today. The analyst C. Rajamohan is quoted offering this perspective. The foreign policy challenge lies not in seeking to change the world, but in learning to live with it. A modest foreign policy and an ambitious domestic development agenda, with the former totally subservient to the latter, must be the guiding principles for India in the early decades of the new century.
That's an interesting take. A modest foreign policy, subservient to domestic development. Now, considering everything we've unpacked today, India's stated ambition for a rightful place among great powers, the clear assertiveness shown after Pokhran II, the complex balancing act it performed with major global players and neighbors alike, the huge focus on economic growth through policies like Look East.
Does that perspective of a modest foreign policy, primarily just serving the domestic agenda, truly capture India's foreign policy trajectory as we've seen it evolve up to the early 2000s?
Or is there perhaps a fundamental tension between this view, this call for modesty, and the ambition for great power status that the source also discusses as an outcome, even a driver of India's policies during this period?
Something to think about, isn't it? As India continues to navigate the global stage today, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.